Hello. Today I've come to talk to you about psychotic tendencies. Now, psychotic tendencies can bring a very fearful and just completely out of body experience that can lead you to believe things that aren't true. And this happens over a slow time. You don't really expect it coming. There are thoughts in your head that, appear to be normal at first, but are just doubtful, constantly doubtful thoughts. And you start fearing that you can't trust the people around you, which I think this stems a lot from BPD for me. That paranoia comes with BPD anyways. Like when I was with my ex-husband and I couldn't really trust what he was saying, and I learned to even go along with it. So I haven't even dealt with my mistrust or paranoia when it comes to BPD or psychosis. I'm still on the level that I like to think the best of people. I'm a little naive. And when you're in psychosis, it seems so whimsical and entertaining that you just kind of go with it, and there can be misery involved, and you don't want to hurt anybody with it, but you want to share it. And that's what got me in big trouble when I went into my psychosis for the first time in 2008. I brought my little daughter into the emergency room saying I was in a ton of pain, and I was a dancer, and I had been doing it a short time, and I realized that I had pain from head to toe. I didn't really know how to describe it. Unlocalized pain doesn't mean a lot to a doctor. They wonder about infectious disease and things like that. They're constantly asking the same questions when you come into the doctor's office. Have you traveled out of the country? Have you been exposed to MRSA, etc., etc.? And one of them is infectious disease when you come in pain. And instead of treating me like a medical patient, they treated me as a psych patient because I had also had fears that my stepfather had sexually molested me, which were delusions. They were just my subconscious replacing memories that I couldn't really remember that I'm just fearful of abuse, to something that I could picture in my head. I don't know why I have these pictures in my head, but I knew as I got older that it was kind of planted in my brain, and it wasn't what I should really believe. It was kind of a replace of the dark times that I don't really understand. And I think that every psychosis, if you look into it too deeply and overthink it, then it can turn into something like some big catastrophe. And if you think about it, like, I don't believe these delusions, it kind of slowly fades away into like a breakthrough psychosis where you sort of have the ability to decide whether you believe something is true or untrue. And breakthrough psychosis is much milder, and it only pertains to cases that still struggle with the stress of life. Sometimes people don't catch a break and they're still having so many doubts, and the doubts can be unreal. They can just be made up in your head. They can be a serotonin imbalance. It can be so many things. Psychosis is treated with antipsychotics, which I've been on for 9 years, and it's the best thing that's treated my bipolar, my psychotic tendencies, and my borderline personality disorder. Abilify is an excellent medication, and I prescribe it most. I would prescribe it most if I were a doctor to patients who suffer with the things that I suffer with, like social anxiety, since it's so closely related to autism. It also treats symptoms for that, and that is something that I think has worked for me. Although I still suffer from feelings extremely different and not really knowing, what to explain my psychosis as. I've been committed so many times, 9 times at the hospital, and I mean, I have stories that are crazy. I had a friend escape from the mental institution. She literally just ran away. And of course, they caught her and brought her back, and she ended up getting ECTs, electromagnetic shock. And it was a scary time when I saw her enter the building, and she had these eyes that were kind of vacant, and it was like she wasn't really talking to me, although the words were directed at me. And it was just kind of a strange experience to witness somebody like that. Since I have so many mental disorders, I worry about dissociative identity disorder. Now, this is kind of off topic, but they also prescribe ECTs for people with dissociative identity disorder. I'm not sure what it is about the magnetic field being into your brain, how it's supposed to change your thought process. Maybe it scares you out of your thought process. I'm not really sure how it works, because when I dissociate, I've done things that I can't remember and that I wouldn't usually have done, but can find some rational reason inside somewhere, some part of my personality that would accept it. So I have such a broad outlook about things, and I think that's why I was susceptible to psychosis. I went to the hospital for the first time believing strange things, like I was molested by my stepfather, which wasn't true, that my mom wasn't really my mom, and that my aunt was my mom. I also believed that people were talking cryptic to me, like my uh, aunt told me to get a brain scan, which she actually told me that, and they did do some sort of test on my brain, like an MRI or whatever, and asked me questions about whether I hear voices, or if it was more like racing thoughts, and I thought it was more like racing thoughts. And they declared me bipolar with PTSD because of the sexual trauma, although I didn't explain that the sexual trauma actually happened when I was 4 years old with an older boy. But they dealt with the sexual trauma by diagnosing me with PTSD. But because I didn't really address with the correct sexual trauma, that wasn't something I focused on, and I lost my PTSD diagnosis, and more I became made out to be like a bad person, because I would end up back in the mental institution unaware of what put me there. And now I know that chemicals of any sort, whether it be from the food, overeating, drugs, alcohol, can all cause high chemicals in your body that will take away your serotonin and make it unable to make rational decisions, and impair you in many different personality and mental illnesses. And it's all very, very concerning that it's all kind of linked together. Um, from the comparison between social anxiety disorder, avoidant disorder, and ADD, how it's all sort of in the same, and bipolar, all sort of in the same spectrum. And psychosis can come with any one of these, where you start believing things that are not necessarily untrue, even, but some kind of variation of what's going on that would make you overreact, because the doctors are really looking for you to overreact, and they want to see what's going on, what's wrong, because it's all sort of a push in the direction for you to recognize what you're doing wrong in your life, whether it be your diet, or the choices you're making with relationships, because relationships can be very dangerous if you're not focused on working things out correctly. And there are precautions that you should take to make sure that you work these relationships out correctly. And other ways are just the problem with instant gratification, where you think that there's an immediate way to make you feel better, like driving too fast, or promiscuous sex, or something like that, something instantaneous that will make you feel better. All of these are signs that you could be going into a psychosis, because your mental illness that you are diagnosed with is kind of overreacting. and you come up with some delusional way to get through it. And on top of that, people really put a lot of pressure on you, and you never know when they're tricking you, and you never know when they're trying to get you in a place where you're vulnerable, because honestly, when you're vulnerable, they can find out about things about you, about it's pretty much like they want to find out that they don't like you. And people with psychosis can be very likable people, even with breakthrough psychosis, as long as you can see through it. Because if you look at it like a psychic, everything has a representation. Like in my fourth stay at the psychiatric hospital, I called 911 as many times as I possibly could, insisting that my ex-husband was going to kill my son. And then 2 years later, he was taken away by DCYF and given to my mother because there was abuse in the home. So JC may not be dead, but he was in the position to be physically abused. And I feel like 2 years before, I had the premonition that it was happening, and it finally grew out of control. But that little kid had to experience 2 years of that abuse when I had the premonition, or what people say are a delusion, that it was happening earlier than that. And there's nothing I could do to stop it because I confronted it to everybody. I had my daughter tell my mother-in-law. Um, I talked to my ex-husband about the other children, and it seemed to put um, a light under his butt. But the changes that he made were also very diabolical in how he could manipulate the children, because it always seemed like I was trying to play the good guy while having a hard time keeping in touch. And it wasn't my fault. The court ordered visitation, and there's been many mix-ups between me not having a car, me being financially unstable, and just a lot of stuff that I've had to figure out with my mental illness. And it's taken me so much time to understand that you can get yourself in a psychosis, and it's only because you're a little too enthusiastic with your mania to believe so many things. And if you're already an impressionable person where you'll definitely take things personally, and you can't help it, it's almost like exaggerating the mental illness itself. So basically what I'm saying is these symptoms that come with psychosis, they are all uh, very clear, and they go by a standard of care by medical facilities. And there's just more to them that I'd like to explain, because there's a lot that people don't understand. Like difficulty concentrating. I think that psychosis comes from an overwhelming amount of stress coming from borderline personality disorder, which you dissociate over too much stress. And psychosis comes when you have too much stress. So it depends on how it goes. Because for me, it just goes into like panic mode and not a psychosis now. But I'm being made to look like it's a psychosis because, like I said, when you have too many vulnerabilities, people tend to notice and they can pit them against you. And there's nothing you can do about that but try to be aware that you don't need to share all your vulnerabilities. Unlike me, who has made a lot of mistakes and ruined her life with mental illness by exposing so many of my vulnerabilities. Sometimes you can believe that you are so mad that punishing yourself is the best way to punish someone else, but honestly, it only actually punishes you, and you end up being the one that is not successful, the one that is ruminating about the past, thinking about the past over and over and over again, and that can cause a psychosis. Amongst that, a depressed mood can cause a psychosis. You know, not wanting to get out of bed, not wanting to brush your hair, not wanting to do your makeup, the normal things that you do every day, make yourself breakfast, walk the dog, whatever it might be. Not wanting to do these sorts of things can lead to psychosis and be an example of psychosis. Extreme anxiety, suspiciousness, which when I started going into a psychosis, when I got thoughts in my head, I was just a 16-year-old girl and my future husband, had cheated on me. And I thought all my friends were out to get me, so I became a really dominant, mean figure to try to control the whole situation. But I still did things like work and my own life, and I don't really know what happened, but I've never been a trusting person since. Withdrawal from family or friends is a big sign of psychosis because you feel sort of out of it in another world. You're imagining things or over imagining things, is what I would perceive about the world. That you get pictures in your head, which are like hallucinations. And you basically see stories, you hear stories, and it's been happening to me on different times since 2012 when my ex-husband tried to kill me by choking me to the floor and by other sexual abuse. And basically, ever since then, I've had these off and on symptoms, so they call it psychotic tendencies. And I believe different things about myself, like delusions of grandeur, like I wish I had a movie and I should be famous because I have so much to offer about my story, and I'm a dancer, and I write, and there's music, and delusions of grandeur that it's possible that I could do that. But I've experienced suspiciousness. I've been robbed recently, so that makes me particularly suspicious. But actually, it's quite common for a person to experience, great worry when they're in a state that they don't really quite understand, and they want to just be a detective and figure it out. And it causes a lot of worry. So you can understand why you'd be suspicious. It's pretty logical. Withdrawal from family and friends is another big one, which I've always had a problem with, but I do indulge in fantasy. I believe that somehow, things can work out. Even when you hear the most negative things, I constantly think the positive side of everything. And I only hope that that would be the side that would bring me out of psychosis, because supposedly thinking negative is not the way to go. But some people perceive me as kind of a false happiness, like I'd run around with a smile on my face even when something bad is happening. And that's a sign of psychosis, when you see someone who is too happy when they're not supposed to be. They're thinking things in their head that keep them happy, and it's on a path of destruction. They're not being fed the right uh, learning material. They're being fed with delusions about their life, and either that's the way they're going to live, or they come into like a crash and burn, and they have to wake up and realize that everything they thought was real was a lie. And it's very traumatic for a person who goes through psychosis, and it's recommended that there be 2 weeks bed rest after you leave the hospital, and someone to look after you, because there's such a high rate of suicide. And I caution those that are experiencing difficulty with psychosis not to let it get to suicide, to make sure you call the suicide prevention hotline. And I have the number here. Doo -doo -doo. 1-800-273-8255. That is the suicide hotline. And it's very important that if you're experiencing too much stress from your condition, that you call, and there are people that you can talk to. Sometimes it's difficult to talk to people like that because they don't have the empathy that you're looking for. And I believe what brings people back to life from any mental illness is a lot of empathy and a one-on-one environment where a person feels that kind of devotion because they come to a not trusting place. They experience so much pain and trauma to get themselves here. They are not villains, they are victims. And it's just sort of a silly way to mess your head up. And you get stuck in a psychosis and you believe things that are not true. And as far as psychosis goes, yeah, technical difficulty. Um, you can also experience delusions and hallucinations, which I talked to you about, where you believe things that are not true, or you see things in your head that are not true, or pictures, or whatever have you. You have disorganized speech, and I noticed that with my past psychotic behavior. I would constantly be searching for, I still do it, search for a word, but no, I'd be on a much more like high extent of a level where I would just go blank. Like, what was I even talking about? Because I couldn't find the right word. And disorganized speech kind of lingers around that because when you can't quite spit out what you're saying, it just sounds disorganized and it distracts you from the next thought, and it's pretty easy to point out. So if someone's going through a psychosis, really talking to them is going to point it out most of all, because they're going to have a difficult time expressing exactly what they usually would say. When you can say that you usually know a family member and you can tell they aren't talking right, it's oftentimes a psychosis. Or if they're talking to themselves even, it's a psychosis. And this can lead to Great Depression and state hospitals, which the state hospital is actually kind of an interesting experience. Me being psychologically inclined, I liked watching all the other patients and seeing what they are about. I knew how to draw my limits because some of the patients were so crazy that they were sexually inclined to sleep together in the bathroom, or horrible stories about a man putting his semen on his notebook, and a lot of disabilities, a girl whose arm fell off or hand fell off and she just has to live that way, a man who constantly shakes with Tourette's, um, just schizophrenic women who don't really, they can carry on a conversation and they seem well quite often, but there's just something disorganized about the whole thing. Schizoaffective, where it kind of comes and goes. I had a friend who had to go get EZTs because she was having schizoaffective in her brain, and that made me completely against DID, as though I could ever confront dissociative identity disorder, because shocks is something that I don't think I could ever face if they ever thought that I was that delusional by sharing the fact that I can dissociate into about 5 different personalities. But the psychosis, leaves me open to that, people saying, oh, I just don't see it, and not giving the credit that I deserve. And I feel like I should call disabilities rights, because my therapist would always say, I don't see borderline personality in you, when I can describe all the traits from like 13 on, if not a younger age. And depression is something I was diagnosed at 16, and all these, leading up to all these struggles, at some point I just decided I couldn't endure the stress. And I decided on some level to just submit to going to the hospital, which I think not all people choose, because it's kind of a lifestyle choice. You have a stigma over your head if you go to the hospital and you get help. I had children, I had really no choice but to get help. But what I didn't expect is for me to never really get the help and just be stuck in services because I needed the medication. But it's how they make money, is through the pharmaceuticals. So I basically went to the mental institution and it was like we were talking to each other through our minds. That's one thing I can recollect. I was told to write chaos because there was a book that I can't recollect that was full of nothing but chaos, and then I could write another book full of nothing but chaos. And then I read a book on AIDS about the 7 first doctors of AIDS and how it wasn't going to take over the whole world because people had immunities to the plague back in the Dark Ages. And I read a book about Marilyn Monroe and her struggle to get famous because it took her quite a while. She was famous for her bikini shot and the infamous white dress blowing up with the heating vent in the subway. And that was a very good book. And while I was in psychosis, it wasn't like I was really believing a lot that wasn't true. I did believe my ex-husband slept with my mother and sister, but you have to wonder about how everything that is said in a psychosis is somehow relevant because I learned things from a psychosis, then through other people, like they were confirming that I wasn't completely out of my mind. But it's like it seems so detrimental and dramatic while it's happening that you're like more emotional than you would really be if you had time to think it through. And but a psychosis sometimes comes on so strong and so sudden that you don't even see it happening, and um you hear something talking, and you haven't even noticed it for the first 3 weeks, and it's been like brainwashing you. They said the television was going to brainwash you, and they said the radio is going to brainwash you, all the music's going to brainwash you, but I think that we all hear thoughts in our head, and it comes from a higher force, like the aliens or the ghosts. Some kind of hierarchy is out there, and it's controlling us. We're like the Sims game, is what I would believe. But there's much good in people who are bipolar, who only think like this. There are good people who experience a psychosis and recover from it and can just tell the tale of everything that happened. And there's a lot of scary stories where people were lost in psychosis and they couldn't get help because they didn't even know how. And those people shouldn't suffer. The stigma of mental illness shouldn't be there where there's grocery shop mentally ill people. They should be in housing, and I truly believe that a psychosis isn't the end of the world. It's something that you recover from. You need to go ahead and you need to stop smoking and drink a lot of water and eat a healthy diet and not absorb chemicals, and you won't go into a psychosis. And I believe that it does accompany bipolar, which is not something that is so easily controlled, and I'm going to talk about that in another vlog. But it can also accompany like a schizophrenia, but I'm not sure how that works because they're so similar. And it's just something that some people suffer from, and they call it psychotic tendencies for me because I have done it on 4 occasions. So, and it's not like I point people as liars and they have stolen from me or anything like that. Like actual events have taken place, and I've been made out to be having psychotic tendencies. Now I know I have risk-taking behaviors and I do things that are a little crazy, and that can be perceived as psychotic. So psychotic and borderline personality are interesting to compare to because it's almost like a borderline personality acting out as a psychotic person. And I think it's an interesting comparison. So, but psychosis is something that takes about 3 weeks to come out of. It depends on what induces it. It depends on how well you want to come out of it. Reading really helps. It grounds you into something that you can understand slowly, step by step. And pet therapy is supposed to help because you remember love and you remember how everything kind of works and the nature of things. and you just slowly decide that you're going to stop the delusions and that's not the real world anymore, and the medication works and it just fades away. And it's really unknown as how long it can take, because for some people it's something that's so drastic that it takes years because it's off and on. That's why they call it tendencies for me, and it's due to traumatic stress. But for some people, it's just a psychosis. It's just something they go through, and it's history. It's just a funny story to tell parents. And mine's about trauma, and it's a little more depressing. But it's the story. It's what I went through, and it's the psychosis I dealt with. I was even put in a white restraining vest that reminded me of a white jacket, and thrown in the hole, and I had to be given Haldol by injection because I was flipping out so much. And that was over them not letting me call 911 and my ex-husband for beating my son, when 2 years later they did find him abusing my son, and they took him away by the state and gave him to my mother. So you have to wonder about what exactly are the meaning the messages are telling you when you have a psychosis, and if it's something that is completely outlandish that has nothing to do with you, or is it something that could change your life forever. So that's what I'd like to say about psychosis, and I appreciate you listening. My name's Nicole. I have a blog. It's The Life of an Abused Girl from the Start.com. Please check it out. It's more about my life. And also, I want you to watch this blog. Please comment on it. Please like it. I only have one subscriber, and I really want more. So I hope you appreciate my rant on psychotics, and we can talk about something exciting again in the future. Thank you. Much love. Peace.